and welcome to this event organised by the Oxford Global Society. The Oxford Global Society is a relatively new think tank. Its main objectives are to be non-political, to be independent, and to bring to public attention issues of international interest, hence the name Oxford Global Society. My name is Dennis Galligan, Professor of Socio-Legal Studies Emeritus at Oxford University, and I'm Director of the Oxford Global Society. We're assembled here today to discuss Professor Richard Caplan's book called Measuring Peace, Principles, Practices, and Politics. I assume that many of our audience will have read this book. It's a very short book, commendably short. I must ask Richard later how he manages to write short books. I have the opposite problem. Never mind, it certainly is a very well written, a very concise and carefully argued book. And the object of the book is to measure peace. Before I introduce the book more fully, let me just introduce our three main participants. First of all, Richard Caplan himself is Professor of International Relations at Oxford University and a Fellow of the Oxford Global Society. Richard's research is concerned principally with international organizations and conflict management. We have two commentators, Professor Christine Bell, Professor of Constitutional Law at Edinburgh University, co-director of the Global Justice Academy, and a Fellow of the British Academy. She is the author of two very important books. The first, Peace Agreements and Human Rights. The second, On the Law of Peace. Our second commentator is Mr. Alan Doss, former director and president of the Kofi Annan Foundation. Prior to joining the foundation in 2011, Alan worked for the United Nations on peacekeeping, development, and humanitarian assignments around the world. These assignments included UN peacekeeping appointments as the special representative of the UN Secretary General in Liberia, and then in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Alan also is an author, and his most recent book is A Peacekeeper in Africa, Learning from UN Interventions in Other People's Wars. So we have three very distinguished participants today. Just before I introduce Richard, I'll outline the procedure. So Richard will give a very brief account of the main argument of his book. Then I'll call on Christine to comment, followed by Alan to comment. I may even have a comment or two myself, but then we'll ask Richard very briefly to reply. And after that, I'll open for discussion. So the audience is then welcome to send in questions, comments, and I hope that we will have a very lively and animated discussion around this issue of measuring peace. It is hard to imagine a more important subject just at the moment than how to measure peace, given the circumstances of today. On the timing, I hope we will finish about 1:15. We may be able to go on for a few more minutes, but experience suggests that about an hour and a quarter is the optimum time for events such as this. However, we have some flexibility. Just to give you an idea of Richard's book before I invite him to introduce it, it may be useful just to have clearly in our minds the question that Richard poses at the beginning. He asks, how can we know if the peace following civil war is a stable peace? This concerns the quality of peace. Peace, of course, is a very open, or as Richard says, contested concept. So what are the decisive qualities of a stable and lasting peace? Or put slightly differently, how to assess the durability of peace. bear in mind it's one thing to get to peace, it's quite another to sustain peace over time. That leads back, I think, to the causes of conflict and how you move from those causes to the various stages towards a stable peace. That requires, according to Richard, a rigorous assessment of the very concept of peace. And on that note, Richard, I hand over to you.
Dennis, thank you very much. And to the commentators for joining today, and to the very many participants. Delighted to see so many other people at this meeting. I'm going to share my screen with you with any success. And I'll proceed from there if you give me just one moment. Well, as Dennis has just said, one of the questions, if not the key question, at the heart of my book is the following: how do we know that the peace that has been established following a civil war is a stable peace? And by stable, I mean not prone to relapse. Now, peace stability is one dimension, just one dimension of a quality peace. It's not the only dimension, but it is an important dimension. Indeed, as the war raging in Ukraine at the moment makes very, very clear. And peace stability can't be taken for granted. Conflict-affected countries are particularly vulnerable to conflict relapse, as you can see in this slide. Now, what this depicts, a colleague, Anke Heffler, and I looked at all civil wars that ended in or after 1990 until 2013, and we looked at how long the peace endured in each case. Now, for purposes of this analysis, the start of a peace period or peace spell is marked by the end of armed conflict, whether that peace is established as the result of a military victory, a ceasefire, a peace agreement, or simply the fizzling out of an armed conflict. And the peace has to have lasted for at least a year. And in the period that we observed from 1990 to 2013, there were 210 peace spells. That is, 210 conflict episodes ended in a peace that lasted for at least a year. Now, just to be clear, these are not 210 separate conflicts. A single conflict can have multiple conflict episodes and multiple peace spells. It can stop and start. But what this chart depicts is how many of the peace spells break down and when this happens. It shows how long peace survives or peace endures as measured in days. So at the beginning, as you would expect, all our observations are at peace. Peace has been established. But after 2 years, already a significant number of peace spells survived, 99% of them. Only 1% of all peace spells have failed and armed conflict has recurred. But after 3 years, 83% of the peace spells have survived. After 12 years, about half of the peace spells, only half of the peace spells have survived. So that's a high rate of conflict recidivism or peace failure. So one very important reason why peace stability matters is because there is a high rate of conflict relapse or conflict recidivism. Now, conflict relapse or conflict recidivism is the main reason why the UN Peacebuilding Commission was established at the World Summit back in 2005. The UN member states that approved the establishment of the Peacebuilding Commission, the PBC, did so, and I'm quoting from the Security Council and General Assembly resolution that established that entity. They did so recognizing the need for a dedicated institutional mechanism to address the special needs of countries emerging from conflict towards recovery, reintegration, and reconstruction. And special needs refers to the fragility of the peace in countries emerging from armed conflict. These countries are especially fragile because of the conflict that they've been through. And historically, there's been a tendency for these countries to fall off the radar of the international community precisely at this critical moment in the early post-conflict period when they need support. Attention often moves on to other crises. But the question that arises is, when should a country graduate? When should a country come off the PBC's agenda? And that's a challenge facing the PBC today, as well as donor countries and other multilateral organizations that are engaged in peace building. When effectively should they conclude their work or either bring it to an end or draw down? And it's a genuine practical concern, not a academic, not a hypothetical challenge. Now, the enabling Security Council and General Assembly resolution that established the PBC does have an answer to that question, and it's the following. The Commission shall terminate its consideration of a country-specific situation when foundations for sustainable peace and development are established or upon the request of national authorities of the country under consideration. But this language only begs the question, what are the foundations for sustainable peace and development? That's what we need to know. And the problem is, fundamentally, that there are no hard measures or indicators of a sustainable peace, of a consolidated peace. In contrast, say, to the indicators of a prosperous economy, we have various macroeconomic fundamentals for that purpose, or indicators of a healthy population, literacy rates, immunization rates. Contentious, though some of these can sometimes be. I mean, we know, for instance, that GDP growth as a measure of economic prosperity is something that's much debated. The ultimate test of a sustainable peace, at least in cases where third parties like peacekeepers have intervened, necessarily comes after the fact. That is, only when the international community has drawn down significantly or exited. That's when we really know whether a peace can survive. But third parties want to know that a peace is stable before they exit. Now, there is a recognition of the importance of monitoring the quality of peace and the progress of peace consolidation. And there's also recognition of the difficulty, as is evident in this quote. Monitoring the progress of peace is of such obvious value in any post-conflict society that the worth of doing so is rarely, if ever, challenged. However, the means used to do so is another matter. So how do the major peace building actors assess progress towards the achievement of a consolidated peace? How do they know whether the peace that they're working to establish is a self-sustaining peace? And the fact is that they often don't monitor progress, or they don't do it well enough. I mean, to begin with, rarely are peace building organizations actually tasked with assessing the robustness of the peace that they're helping to build. It's something that I call in my book strategic assessment. Very rarely do they conduct strategic assessment. What is very common is reporting. Reporting on developments in the field is a widespread practice, but reporting itself is not the same as strategic assessment. Every head of a UN peacekeeping operation, and Alan Doss will know this only too well, submits formal periodic reports to the Secretary General on the situation in the country, often on a quarterly or a semi-annual basis. And what you see here is a facsimile of a report of the special representative to the Secretary General. The Secretary General in these reports, the Secretary General in turn reports to the Security Council, and that's actually what we're seeing here. The reports vary in the content, but they typically provide an overview of major developments since the last report, an evaluation of progress in the implementation of the mandate of the operation, and a discussion of the key challenges facing the country and the operation. But again, not a strategic assessment of the quality of the peace that's being established. Reporting has tended to be ad hoc and rather impressionistic. The UN Secretariat lacks a uniform understanding of the purpose of a field report and a Security Council briefing, and little guidance is offered in preparing them. Now, there's a tendency also to measure what can be measured easily. So, for instance, the number of training sessions on human rights organized for police officers, rather than their qualitative effects. That is, how respectful the police are of human rights. In other words, what's often measured are outputs rather than outcomes, because outcomes are very difficult to measure. It involves a lot more work to monitor the work of local police to see that whether to what extent they are being respectful of human rights. Another characteristic of assessment is the focus on mandate implementation. Now that's reasonable. After all, these operations are given a mandate by the Security Council or by whatever other authorizing body they answer to. But mandates don't always reflect the requirements for achieving a sustainable peace. For one thing, mandates are often the fruits of political compromise. The other problem with assessment is that it's often partial and not holistic. And in a way, that is a casualty of our own success, by which I mean that peace building now is the business of many organizations, governmental, non-governmental. And as a consequence of that, there is something of a division of labor with different organizations, different donor governments having responsibility for different aspects of building the peace in a conflict-affected country. And as a consequence, they are focused on their patch, their particular patch and progress that they're making in that area, and not on the peace that's being built overall. So broadly speaking, the concern is fundamentally about evaluating the performance of peace operations, not with evaluating the quality of the peace that these operations are helping to produce. And it's important to appreciate that difference. So in my book, what I do is I identify what I consider to be principles of good practice drawn from actual good practice. I look at the work of a number of organizations, NATO, the OSCE, the United Nations, some non-governmental organizations, the European Union, and from the good practice, and there's quite a lot of it, notwithstanding what I said about some of the weaknesses of assessment, I identify a number of good principles of good practice, and I'll mention just three of those. First and foremost is what I call an ethnographic approach. Now, an ethnographic approach for the purpose of strategic assessment would favor greater reliance on knowledge of local culture, local history, and especially the particular conflict dynamics at work in a given conflict, including at the micro level. Séverine Althusser, a Columbia University professor, has written a very good book on the practice of peace building called Peaceland, in which she states familiarity with local context is crucial. In-depth knowledge of local histories, cultures, traditions, attitudes, and worldviews remains critical throughout project implementation. Now, I appreciate that that can be difficult to achieve, but it is vitally important. Another principle is the importance of continual strategic reassessment. Do the original objectives still support the broad strategic goals of the peace-building operation? Have new or unanticipated threats or impediments to a stable peace emerged? External security challenges or inauspicious political shifts within the country that may require the articulation of new or altered objectives? Has available implementing capacity, either internationally or nationally, changed? And what implications does this have for meeting an operation's objectives and for achieving a sustainable exit? These are critical questions, the answers to which give a good indication of how robust the peace is. And a third, but not the final principle I mentioned, is the incorporation of local perspectives in the analysis. And here I invoke the innovative work of Roger McGinty and Pamina Furcho, who use community-generated indicators to determine whether and to what extent peace has been established in conflict-affected communities. Now, I'm not suggesting that local communities should have the final word, but peace needs to be meaningful for those who are emerging from conflict. Now, I appreciate that strategic assessment, what I'm describing here, is not easy. And I'll close with highlighting some challenges that we may want to discuss further uh, uh, in the conversation. Now, first of all, how do we measure peace? What do we measure when we're talking about peace? This is a fundamental question. And at the very least, as I've been saying, it's the absence of armed conflict, what we sometimes call a negative peace. But is that all peace is? Sometimes that's the best that we can achieve. That's the nature of the peace we have, for instance, in Kosovo between Serbs and Albanians at the moment. Many would argue, however, that that's a weak peace, a deficient peace. Peace understood as not war conflates the character of peace as varied as that which prevails in Sweden, for instance, with that in North Korea. Both countries at present would qualify as states at peace by this minimal definition, this minimal measure, but the quality of peace in each case obviously differs dramatically when one takes into consideration forms of violence other than armed conflicts, such as aggressive policing or torture and other forms of repression that are prevalent in North Korea and not in Sweden. Now, some would say quality peace exists only when there's mutual respect and fundamental goodwill between relevant actors. Some would go even farther and say that peace only exists when all structural violence in a society has been eliminated, institutionalized discrimination, for instance. How far do we go in defining peace? This has clear implications for how we measure peace.
Richard, sorry to interrupt you, but can you gradually wind up?
Okay, well, I'll just mention that there are two others. Again, we can take these up in discussion rather than in presentation. One is the challenge of measuring peace in divided societies when there is no consensus as to what kind of peace should be achieved. And another is the politicization of measurement. This is a quote, curiously, from a not very scrupulous person, Elliot Abrams, a former US government official who was implicated in the Iran-Contra controversy, but he did have something appropriate to say about politicizing intelligence, which is relevant to the problem that we sometimes face of politicizing measurement. I'll just read it and then I'll close with one or two other words. But he writes, what does politicizing intelligence mean? Using intel, or more often partial intel, to produce an effect in line with White House policies rather than giving a full picture of a particular situation. And there are a lot of experiences in which assessment has been subordinated to the needs or the views of headquarters. So I'll just close by, well, the last thing I would have said is the importance of local knowledge, which is reflects what I said earlier about the importance of an ethnographic approach. But just to conclude, I'm not saying that strategic assessment is a panacea. By all means, our ability to understand conflict dynamics, which are very, very complex, is inherently limited. So we have to recognize that we can't always get our head around what is going on, what in political science or social science generally we refer to as bounded rationality. And the other thing is that as good as our assessment can sometimes be, at the end of the day, politics will often trump other considerations, and budgetary concerns or national interests will override sound judgments about the quality of peace that's been established and the implications of that for policy. So Dennis, I'll leave it at that. Just to answer my own question, can we know that the peace that's been established following a civil war is a stable peace? No, but it is possible to ascertain the quality of a peace and the vulnerability of that peace to conflict relapse with higher levels of confidence. And that's what I try to do in this book. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for such an exemplary introduction, synopsis of great clarity to your book. You have set a high bar for our commentators to meet. And on that score, I call on you, Christine, to offer some comments on Richard's book.
And I'm all ears.
So thank you very much. I would just like to, first of all, congratulate Richard on his book. It's a book that I think the best tribute I can pay it is, I say I thoroughly read before I was asked to be at this event, because actually it's engages with issues that we've really been thinking about, and we've found the book incredibly helpful to our thinking. So I was just going to say a couple of things about why the book is important, why it's important to say the work that we're doing, which is a slightly different focus than Richard's central question, and also explains where my comments are coming from. So I have worked for a long time around understanding how parties agree to exit conflict through negotiated agreement. And a critical issue actually at the point of negotiations, often more for non-state armed actors than state actors, is will the agreement be implemented? So often there's a lot of fanfare about an agreement, but often both local citizens and armed actors are saying, well, is the war really over? Who won? And will any of these commitments be adhered to? So I think the book, in regard to doing that sort of thinking, is really important in two respects. First of all, I think just by acknowledging that peace itself is a nebulous concept, I think what Richard does is deceptively simple, but just points out really that understanding that we haven't a consensus about peace has to be disaggregated from and separated out from the idea that there are different measurements that we think are part of peace. And Richard himself in his presentation, I think, also showed that there's open questions, I guess, as to how far and how thick we make that notion of peace beyond a negative peace. But I think actually this central idea that we have to distinguish an idea of measuring peace from measuring what we might consider to be the effects of peace is really important and often overlooked, because we can tend to skirt around and say, well, we kind of know what peace means. The second thing I think the book does that's really helpful is to really actually chart out the variety of methodological approaches to how peace could be measured, and the ways in which practical projects of peace measurement are developing these. And I think it's actually a really useful contribution to have them pulled together so well in one place, because they are very varied. I think also what Richard offers as the solution, if you like, is interesting, which is partly to set out guidelines for what good practice are. And those guidelines, I think, push for a mix of quantitative and qualitative assessments, and also matching the local and the international perceptions and understandings of peace. And fundamentally, I think the book gets all these things right, but it's obviously no fun. It's no fun if we completely agree. So I wanted to set out some of the challenges which we've looked at and that were encountered. And I think they actually resonate with some of the open questions that Richard sent out rather than contradict them. But I suppose some of the problems we've encountered when we've been looking at how might we think about peace agreement implementation and measurement, which is a slightly different thing, right? First of all, actually, one of the things we've really seen in use of data is you have to know why you're measuring and for what purpose you're measuring. And here I think international actors and local actors really have different ideas of what's at stake. Often international actors are focused on when do we get to leave, how do we exit, and want to set a benchmarks. In fact, all missions now have to set benchmarks for exit as part of what they track. maybe that's what leads them a little bit into the lack of strategic assessment. But local actors often, depending on who they are wanting to measure much more robust positive peace, and also often have this idea that is also quite nebulous of, are the root causes of the conflict assessed? So I suppose one of my questions is, can we really marry forms of measurement across local and international when people are measuring to really different ends? And I suppose just I'm very aware of the conversations I have in different spheres are so different. You know, I've had somebody in Northern Ireland say to me, well, I just want to be able to walk through my village where I'm a minority and not sort of be hated. Whereas obviously there's a different measurement for peace for international actors. The second thing I think is addressed by Richard's book and his comments today, which is that actually what local actors want to achieve changes over time. And there's a much more intergenerational difficulty. I really see this in the transitional justice sphere. Often at the point of signing agreements, people say, let's just get it over. The most important thing is to end the conflict. But way down the road, people start to want to form maybe forms of accountability and reparation and accounting that start to reopen questions around, should we call these people terrorists or should we call them democrats? So I think there's a fundamental challenge to how we're measuring peace, to understand that demands of peace also change over time. The third observation, I suppose, is, and I think this connects to Richard's push for strategic assessment, is that given the different international local ends and given the changes over time, often effective implementation of agreements focuses on adaptive management. How can we understand what the latest challenges of peace are? And then the question becomes not, can we just assess, is there a risk of conflict? But what is it that we actually do? And often that doesn't follow easily from the forms of assessment. So the peace agreement challenges are very varied. And I just wanted to push some of the other ways that people, that the kind of dilemmas that Richard grapples with, which in some senses he framed a little bit today around, you know, when should the Peace Building Commission exit, can also be framed around the, what do we mean by good peace agreement implementation and how do we know if it's happened, right? So one of the ways we can measure is we could say, did people keep the promises they made in the agreement? And this is often what the parties are really worried about at the point of signing. And the Croc Peace Agreement Matrix, for example, tracks the commitments made in peace agreements over a 10-year period and kind of registers, is there progress, how much this, when we say, was implemented. And in fact, out of a research project, we're actually built into the implementation mechanism, the Colombian Peace Agreement. But there's problems with this. The first thing is, how long do you do it for? Croc say, well, we just go for 10 years because after that, we don't think things are really dependent on the agreement. They're dependent on other things. And secondly, another problem is, I suppose, the difficulty that some of the things in the agreement turn out not to be a good idea. So for example, in Bosnia, people tried to set up regional human rights instruments. And actually at the point of implementation, they became a bit worried that these might be fora for pushing back on human rights rather than developing and embedding them. And so there's an active decision not to implement those. The third thing is that if we look at what actually measures, and I don't know if there's any way of doing this, often what matters is less, did these pieces get done, and more, is there a sense of momentum to the implementation or not? And I agree that's really intangible and difficult to mention, but often there are opportunities after the peace agreement where change is possible. And then people find a way to regroup and in ways start to pursue the peace agreement implementation as a way of winning the conflict. Some really interesting quotes from armed actors and how they view that. The next thing is, I suppose, just what are the problems then of implementing in another way? So those are the problems of, did people stick to their promises? So what if we revert more to what Richard suggests around peace, you know, a mixed bag of peace performance outcomes? I think here there's a couple of different problems that we've encountered, all of which he alludes to. The first is, what is the appropriate data? and even the data of deaths and conflict negative peace. And partly my interest was sparked in this area because I was reading that in the last year, this is ages ago, reading in the last year of the conflict in Guatemala, 3,000 people died in the conflict. 3 years after relatively successful implementation of peace accords, 6,000 people died in violent homicide, which raises the question of, did the conflict disappear, or was it relabeled, and did it mutate in ways? The second problem is understanding the data that we're working with. And we see this a lot in having dug into the data and then seeing how people use the data, and they don't always align. So if we take the Uppsala death and conflict data, which is really good data, has a really long time period and is really well thought through, but they made a decision to really define conflict around stated goal incompatibility. And it's really important to understand this when you work with the data. So if a goal incompatibility has not been stated by the armed groups, then it doesn't register as violent conflict. It can register as other forms of violence, but it's not related, it's not counted as a battle in the Uppsala data. And similarly, deciding then when the goal incompatibility is reconciled is used. So it's really important to understand what the data is and what it isn't, and that actually people can't change their definitions and have long-term data. The second is the causality problem. It's very difficult to understand, are the outcomes that you're seeing and the changes a result of the agreement or other things that were done? And I suppose a critical question is, does it matter? We're interested in peace agreement implementation, but if it's just good peace building practice that tends to continue, or good development practice, does it really matter whether it's related to the peace agreement or not? Is it not just that stabilization has occurred? And the other issue, which I think Richard does address, is that the challenges of implementation are also very context specific. And actually it can be quite challenging, I think, in balancing local perspectives and that context specificity that Richard really argues with, to also understand how we can have comparative research projects in comparison at all. So is it possible to get a mid-level analysis that's beyond these big sort of global presentations of statistics and conflict recidivism, and really context specific, almost of the moment political analysis of what's going well and what's going badly? And of course, both these forms of analysis are good. People often want to know, is this mean we're on the route to disaster or not? So finally, I think, what are we doing with this, and how are we using Richard's work, and what are we trying to do? I think one of the questions that Richard maybe leaves less answered is, how do we create the qualitative and quantitative mix of the bag of things, and how do we reconcile the fact that people have really different goals to what they want from, say, the peace agreement? And I just maybe to stress how critical that is. We've talked a lot, and I've talked a lot in my work drawing and other people's work about the ways in which you have to resolve the conflict, but also the meta conflict, the conflict about what the conflict is about, right? So different parties in the conflict have different things that they want to see, and people don't wake up one day and suddenly find themselves committed to peace instead of conflict. They often enter the negotiations and the peace agreement to try to achieve better through processes of negotiation, some of what are their war-related goals. And therefore, whether they view the agreement as successful for them will be viewed in the light of whether it has achieved goals that are very incompatible with the other side. And in some senses, agreements are trying to create a sort of imaginary space in the middle where those goals they often conflict manage rather than conflict resolve. They let the parties say, you can still work to achieve your battlefield goals, but we're going to try and create a framework in which you do that through more peaceful disputation and through negotiation over the political institutions. But that creates a challenge for how successful we are in doing that, and it creates a kind of goal incompatibility.
Christine,
yes, so just I suppose one of the things we wonder about is whether you can create a portfolio of indicators And I think some projects that Richard touches on do try to do this, but don't really come up with an overall strategic assessment, but come up with provoke forms of deliberation as to what's going well, what's going badly, why you might be getting very different indicators from different measurements, and what it is you think the response should be to that in terms of the types of intervention you're trying to make. Thanks very much. But also a lot of what we've learned from the book. So thank you.
Oh, and a lot I've learned from you. Thank you very, very much. I'm sure, Dennis, you want to turn first to Alan before.
Oh, yes, I do. Yes, I do. You just keep quiet for a minute. Alan, are you there ready? So, Alan, you have now 15 minutes to follow up on Christine's admirable analysis of a host of issues, I suppose only one or two of which we can possibly discuss. But Alan, over to you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And first, let me say that Richard's book is a very valuable source of analysis and ideas for those who are engaged in, as I was, in planning and running peace operations. In fact, I wish I had had a copy of Richard's book to hand when I was in peacekeeping, although I have to admit that I've struggled a bit with the Cox proportional hazard model. And I would have applied that locally. I have to add also that after 2 decades working in and on peace processes, it's rather depressing to find out that, to quote Richard, military victories provide more long-lasting peace than settlements, and that the presence of UN peacekeeping operations had little, quote, stabilizing effect on peace, unquote. But measuring peace is important because it confronts us with those inconvenient truths. We have to look reality in the face and recognize that often we don't get it right, and I include myself in that category. But measuring and demonstrating progress towards peace was actually a recurring challenge I faced when I was leading large and complex UN peace operations. It's a critical challenge because peacekeeping operations in particular, and more generally peace operations, UN peace operations, are mounted on the assumption that peace is possible. That peace is possible. So the confidence factor becomes ever more important as the duration of a mission lengthens and the cumulative cost increases. However, mission mandates don't actually spell out what peace should look like. Rather, they set out a list of objectives that the Security Council believes that the mission will have to achieve, and doing so help to restore peace. And these objectives tend to follow a standard menu. I'm sure you're familiar with it, a disarmament of armed groups, free and fair elections, security sector reform, political dialogue, overlaid with good admonitions on good governance, promotion of human rights, and the protection of civilians. And as Richard indicated in his book, we developed benchmarks to measure these operational dimensions of our mandates, which in effect became proxy measures for assessing the overall progress towards peace. However, what we didn't do, as Richard recommends, is the kind of strategic assessments that he calls for about the quality of the peace that we were endeavoring to secure, or indeed the countervailing factors that could inhibit the consolidation of peace. In my day, our strategic assessments were essentially an assessment of the work of the mission, and they didn't go beyond that and say, well, where are we going with this? Partly because these assessments were done by insiders, people from within the UN and its different elements. We didn't invite outsiders to this exercise. I know there's been, since I left, further thought on these strategic assessments, and I believe some improvements. But that, I think, was a weakness, which I recognize, because you get stuck in the daily work. It's hard to see above the parapet sometimes. So, for example, we didn't do much analysis in a structured way on the impact of the political economy on the peace process, which in a country like the DRC, and in particular the Eastern DRC, was tremendously important, because the political economy is one of the principal drivers of recurring conflict in the Eastern DRC, and indeed in other countries, as we know. and nor did we undertake the kind of on a systematic basis, the granular analysis of community conflict that, again, Richard points to. But that was in good part not because we didn't want to do it, because in fact, we didn't have the capacity to do so, particularly in a country as vast as the DRC. That involves an on-the-ground, hands-on knowledge of communities and their interaction together, particularly multi-ethnic regions. That was very difficult to do and certainly required capacities beyond those that we had. I can say, however, that in fairness, the UN has made progress in these areas, in part because, and I've started to address these complexities. I think the 2015 high-level report on peace operations, the panel on peace operations, helped a lot because it did point to the same problems and the need that the UN needed to make changes, structural and policy changes, to help confront those challenges. I would just add on that one point, however, that the local and the national cannot be divorced. I often saw how national politicians interfered locally to disrupt the peace process for their own political advantage and pecuniary gain. The two have to move along together. Otherwise, one will disrupt the other. Let me just briefly add a couple of comments or three observations on peace and peacekeeping, drawn more particularly from my own experience. First, as Richard emphasizes, peace agreements per se do not make peace. Nonetheless, in all of the peacekeeping operations in which I participated, the rationale for our presence was to help implement peace agreements. We could not openly question the viability of those agreements, even when we knew that they were not going forward, and in fact had become a fiction. I still remember a meeting I had with one of the signatories to the Côte d'Ivoire peace agreement, Linus Marcoussi agreement, which in many ways was a very good agreement. It touched all the bases, security sector reform to electoral reform and to human rights and so forth. And what he said to me when I reproached him a little bit about why was he objecting to certain provisions in the agreement when he had personally signed it on behalf of the Côte d'Ivoire government. And his response was disarmingly frank. He said, well, I had to sign it at the time because I didn't have another option. But he was clear, he had absolutely no commitment to it. So, but that we continued to work on trying to actually implement Linus Marcoussi, even though clearly it was not going forward. I think a strategic assessment at that point would have helped us a great deal to get everybody to understand we need to move on. We can't get imprisoned by that previous agreement, which eventually was what happened. So I would say in practice, the deployment of peacekeeping missions is in fact something of an act of faith, driven often by humanitarian imperatives rather than a cold calculation of the chances that a mission can actually ensure what Richard refers to as the robustness of peace. A second dilemma has arisen from the increasing engagement of UN peacekeeping in civilian protection, which now dominates mission thinking and planning in most of the major UN peace missions. Civilian protection is, I have to say, a very crisis-prone job. And unfortunately, crisis management tends to inhibit this kind of strategic thinking that Richard calls for. Unfortunately, the urgent usually takes priority over the strategic. Third point I'd make is that UN peace operations generally do not have executive authority, as you all know. And their influence, therefore, on the protagonists waxes and wanes according to what I call the law of diminishing influence. As the threat diminishes, so does the mission's ability to influence the direction of peace. Again, let me quote from experience. President Kabila won with international endorsement the election that was mandated for the end of the transition in the DRC. Having done that, he turned away from his international interlocutors, including me. He refused initiatives, he refused dialogue on issues that we believe would have helped to consolidate peace in the DRC. He was no longer interested. The seduction of sovereignty had taken hold. But despite these difficulties and disappointments, I want to conclude these remarks on a somewhat more positive note. It's now almost 20 years since the horrific wars in Liberia and Sierra Leone ended. Peace and relative stability have prevailed since. But why was that the case when so many countries, as Richard points out in his book, have slipped back into conflict? In fact, the durable post-conflict settlement, of course, has many strands, and they have to be woven together tightly to ensure that the peace does not unravel. I think the most critical one is national leadership. Sierra Leone and Liberia both benefited in the critical early post-war years from good national leadership. Not perfect by any means, but it was a vast improvement. President Kaba and President Johnson Sirleaf were a vast improvement on what went before, and indeed on what has happened elsewhere in other countries. Second, in both countries, security, political and economic reforms went hand in hand, backed up by strong and consistent regional and international support. I think this comprehensive approach is vital. Why? Because people need to feel that there is progress, starting with their personal safety, but encompassing their economic well-being and their political freedoms. My third point would be the presence of a peacekeeping operation, despite Richard's earlier comment in his book. I think it really was important because there was no rush for the exit. The Council was prepared to let the mission stay. We calibrated our drawdown with the stand-up of the National Security Forces, improvement, with the help of bilateral partners, notably the US, the UK, and the EU. So I think that helped because I'm certain, fairly certain, that if we had not been there, not stayed in, with a year or so, there would have been attempted coups, particularly in Liberia, which was still very fragile. President Johnson Sirleaf still had to confront a number of challenges. Our presence helped to stabilize that situation, I think, fend off any potential attempts. Finally, but I think also very critically, Sierra Leoneans and Liberians wanted peace. They mobilized through their local communities, civil society, churches, mosques, and media to push for peace. Peace obviously must be a national project fashioned by local hands. There's no winning formula that external actors, however well-meaning, can impose. So thank you again for this opportunity to speak today. And again, thanks to Richard for truly an excellent book.
Well, Alan, thank you again for a different perspective, but one of equal importance to the others we've heard. So much food for thought. Before I invite Richard to make a very brief response, I'm going to just put in a couple of points myself. I should say I'm a complete outsider in regard to peace agreements, but just reading Richard's book and listening to the commentators, a couple of points occurred to me. When, Richard, you, first of all, I suppose, it seems to me there are various stages in the peace process. I just thinking about it, realize that one is, the first stage is perhaps to solve the conflict, just stop the conflict. That doesn't mean peace, of course. Then the second stage is getting from conflict, stopped conflict to peace. From peace then to something more enduring. So there seems to be a sequence here that needs to be perhaps, or the elements of which need to be perhaps separated out, because each raises its own issues. And of course, as Christine said, implementation then, even if you get a solid peace, implementation raises a host of issues. The second point, Richard, there's one concept missing here, which may be worth inserting: interests. Interests. You talk enormously eloquently about local factors, about all those influences that affect people's ideas. What you don't mention are interests. And it does seem to me that if we go back to interests, at each of those stages, we can ask, what are the interests at stake? And of course, interests lead to social relationships. So we could ask, what are the interests at stake in the conflict? How do we then move from those competing interests to find some accommodation of the interests, and so on. But the interests are continually changing. And of course, if we then add in the interests of the peacekeepers or of international organizations, as you say again in the book, we insert another set of interests into the equation. And of course, this does two things. It shows simply how complex the whole process is, but it also, I think, shows the need to understand that interests change as circumstances change. So I just wondered why interests are not at the foundation of this discussion. On that note, Richard, you have 3 minutes reply.
Oh.
Before we go on to we'll give you 4 minutes, just an act of generosity. But I do want to keep time for questions. I've got quite a lineup of comments and questions. So Richard, you have to be extremely brief and to the point.
Well, I'm going to waste my first minute by telling you how impossible it is to respond in 3, but also to thank the commentators for so carefully reading the book, for offering such astute observations in the little time that we've had today. I've already learned so much from both of you, as I have before on other occasions. Dennis, maybe I'll start with your point, because it can perhaps relate a little bit to what Alan and Christine have just been saying. I do think I talk about interests, maybe not as centrally as you think they should be addressed, but when, for instance, I talk about politicization of measurement, which, how widespread that is, we can have a discussion, but there is a tendency, as I said, to subordinate sometimes measurement and analysis more broadly to precisely what you're talking about, interests. It can be the interests of the dominant members of the Security Council. They can be the interests of donors. They can be the interests of troop contributing countries. They can have a very significant influence, and they can sometimes distort the discourse, the narrative about what's happening on the ground, what needs to be done, how much progress we have achieved. And I could give you, with more time, some examples of that. But I think also Alan made a very good point when he brought up the issue of the political economy of conflicts, of political economy of peace and peace building, something which he acknowledged hasn't been taken into account sufficiently in a lot of our thinking and in a lot of our planning. And that's in that area, I think interests are obviously very central. And I think our failure sometimes to grasp the dynamics of the political economy of peace building it blinds us to something that's really very important, prevents us from being able to identify what are some of the major obstacles to being able to achieve a peace, because the parties to the conflict, or the players on the ground who have the greatest influence, often they do have interests that we have to be able to understand beyond even their stated objectives of political goals and so forth. They often have their hands in projects that yield profits, and if we don't see how what they're seeking is related to what they're trying to gain in other respects, and I think we lose sight of an important dimension of the problem. But this also leads me to, I think, a really important point that Christine made. Again, Dennis, relating to what you were saying about the interests differing and evolving. And I think that, one of the real challenges, both for trying to build peace, but even for trying to understand the requirements of peace as part of the process of building, is the dynamic quality, is the fact that there is this evolution that not only are parties to the conflict, do they have different interests themselves, and there may not be a harmony of interests, as we sometimes, I think, assume, because after all, how else can we achieve peace if we don't assume that there can be some consensus somewhere? But I think that Christine's point about having to be adaptive management, I think is absolutely critical here. And I suppose it relates a little bit to what I was talking about in terms of continuous reassessment, not to assume that the conflicts themselves evolve over time. Political individuals rise and fall in the course of a conflict. Massive displacements of peoples have enormous effects on the aims and objectives of parties to a conflict. I mean, you look at the situation in any given conflict over time, and your analysis at the beginning, in many important respects, I think, would be very, very different from a sound analysis at the end. So I think that we do need to be very sensitive to the changes that occur, and that's something that I think that we get stuck on sometimes an original analysis, and we don't make significant enough adjustments in our own thinking and planning of the response to that conflict. So that was a bit of a gallop. I admit.
You can have another 3 or 4 minutes, Richard.
Well, I'm actually quite interested if, I know I'm not running the show, but if there are comments from other participants, I see a lot of names among the few that appear on my screen of individuals I know. And if there is anybody who would like to weigh in, there are people here, some of them with experience from the field as well. But I don't know whether have any comments come up, Dennis, that are.
Yes, I've got some questions here. So why don't I start off with a question from, let's see, from Keith Fitzgerald. Keith Fitzgerald asks, if I just read, what does your research show about the link between an accurate and thorough conflict assessment and the metrics of a peace that might be achieved? He goes on to ask, shouldn't the measurement of peace be closely correlated, closely correlated with the diagnoses of the causes and drivers of the conflict? That's a long question, Richard. I don't know.
Well, I can.
Of it.
I mean, I do think it is important, as I've just been saying, to understand the dynamics of conflict. And we've been talking amongst ourselves about local context being extremely important, how we need to be sensitive to what's distinctive, if anything, about a given conflict. So yes, I think we have to understand, diagnose the causes and drivers, but again, to be mindful that these change. And so sometimes, for instance, you hear people talk about the root causes of the conflict and the importance of addressing the root cause of the conflict. Well, they may be pertinent, but they may also change. You know, what may have prompted the outbreak of violent conflict may not be driving the conflict at later stages, and so we need to be sensitive, as I said, to that evolution. I don't know if that addresses that question. I see some others there. I don't know, Dennis, you want to pick and choose?
Richard, could I pick that one from the last one there? Kindly address the question that I have raised before. And the question is, what does your research show? No, wait on, I can't see the question. Let's go on to Tim Holt. Can you see Tim Holt?
Yes, I see from theory to practice.
Why don't you take that point up, Richard?
Okay, if a grounded political economy conflict analysis informs understandings of the divisions and connections that drive or reduce conflict and the prospects for peace, could we encourage or collaborate with observers, such as International Crisis Group, as follows: develop a set of concepts and guidelines for an approach to the building of plausible strategic scenarios with monitoring, analysis of associated indicators of sustainable success, informed both from the ground, taking into account geopolitical interests and interference. Well, I mean, maybe I can turn this into a question for Alan as a practitioner. because in the time that, Alan, you served in the field, and the many years you served, we saw the emergence of organizations like International Crisis Group, which before their appearance on the scene, arguably we didn't have such incisive kinds of analysis that they've been able to offer. And I don't know whether this is being fair to Tim, but I'm just wondering to what extent they proved to be useful. Could they have been drawn upon more constructively in understanding and framing perhaps even approaches to managing the conflict and to resolving it?
Good question. Well, ICG, I know very well. It's a fine organization. Some of my colleagues in peacekeeping are now actually working at ICG. So that's been very good. And not only ICG, you know, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, there's a whole plethora now of Médecins Sans Frontières, all of whom are offering advice, usually in quarterly or annual reports with a large number of recommendations. One of the problems for us was managing all that information in the middle, particularly of crises. And to be quite honest, I didn't find the solution. You know, you'd sort of farm it out a little bit and see who was what. And some of those recommendations were contradictory because different organizations have different perspective. Human Rights Watch may not have quite the same view as to how to manage a crisis or armed violence as human rights, as ICG and so on. One thing I would recommend if I was back in the job, I'm not looking forward to doing that, but would be to arrange for perhaps once every quarter, once every 6 months, bring these various actors together to sit down with the SRSG in an off-the-record format for a day or so, just to sort of talk through some of these things. Because I found that even, you know, these excellent reports, they just didn't get really read and digested. There's such a plethora. Remember, you also have all the Security Council stuff, the reports of the Security Council experts. So there's so much information, but not enough consolidated analysis that you can then use and turn into, to some extent, policy, but above all, in terms of operating approaches in the ground. So yes, that information is analysis is extremely important. It's objective. It's done outside of the UN. You know, there is a UN speak, and it's not censored by the UN. So it is very valuable. The question is, how do we maximize the value and apply it?
Right. Well, thank you, Alan. Christine, would you like to come in and comment on this issue?
Yes,
Right.
I mean, I just agree with what Alan said. One of the observations I would have sort of from our engagement with the field is how much every group, like every bilateral donor, every international organization does really quite frequent conflict analysis. But there's very little, it's very difficult for them to share the analysis because, you know, an internal assessment will have diplomatic consequences for both international organizations. And I do think that more ways in understanding how parties could actually come to some point of sort of sharing and deliberating over their analysis. And I think that could also lead on to better streamlining of projects. There's a lovely bit at the end of Teresa Whitfield, who runs the UN Mediation Unit's book on Nepal, where she recounts an observance from a local actor saying, well, we kind of knew what we were doing for peace building, but you seemed to all fund the same projects multiple times in different ways. And it does strike me that certain funders and organizations can do some things and not others. And if there was joint analysis, there could also be a sense of, this is a piece of the puzzle that needs put in. We can't do this, but is there another organization who is well placed to do this? And certainly on the very different, very localized scene of Northern Ireland, that type of analysis of what needs to shift for change to happen, who is it can help leverage that shift, was really important to the projects that were created. So I do think the idea of some sort of ways of coordinating informally over conflict analysis would be really, really useful.
Okay, Richard, do you want to come back on that briefly again?
No, I see other hands that are up, so I wouldn't mind hearing from.
I've only got one here, which takes us into the a question about Russia. I don't know whether we want to get involved.
That may not be. I should have stressed before I began that the book deals with civil wars, with interstate wars. And a lot of what I have to say, I suppose, could be extended to interstate wars, but it wasn't the point of the book, and they are distinct in various other ways. I mean, I guess one thing that we didn't also address that I think Christine identified as an interesting and important issue is the data. I mean, Alan has just been talking about, in some ways, being overwhelmed by analysis, and I can well appreciate that on top of all the demands of a practitioner in the field day to day. We're also seeing the generation of more and more data, actually, and how you manage all that, and how you also ascertain the quality of it. This is what's really, I think, very, very challenging, because obviously in conflict-affected countries where it is important to have reliable, robust data, it's very, very difficult to acquire it, precisely because of the conflict environment. And these are often poor countries that, even in the absence of conflict, do not have very robust data acquisition mechanisms, if you will. So I guess I was wondering, I've been talking about measurement, and to a degree, obviously, measurement is predicated on robust data. But what happens when you really can't be sure about the data that you have, and that uncertainty can manifest itself in other ways as well. I mean, one is, you get conflicting reports. Alan, I'm sure that you must have had with ceasefire violations, very conflicting reports, and you're in a position where you have to make some determination about what's going on the ground. You can't simply ignore the situation altogether. And I should think too that, Christine, for the work that you're doing on peace implementation, that this becomes very important as well, to have reliable data. So it's a problem that we're all wrestling with, and I'm just wondering what your perspectives are on that as well.
Let's have a quick comment. Christine, a quick comment on that? Hello, Christine. Is Christine muted? Christine, would you like to make a quick comment on that last point?
She needs to be unmuted.
Yes, I'm sorry, I can't unmute myself, so I'll have to not mute maybe. Yes, I think, like, for me, this also connects, I think, to the question of what is it you're trying to do with the data. And actually ceasefires are a really curious one that way, because I'm a lawyer, so often the remedy for a breach of a contract is you breach right back. But obviously in a ceasefire, what you're really trying to do is re-corral people into the peace process. So there's really interesting reports from some of the ceasefire monitoring in places like Guatemala and El Salvador. There sometimes can be a need to know at the peacekeeping level that who is breaching, where and how, and to address that. But there's also sometimes a wish to not present publicly, to present more of a balanced breach approach. This was the mission, I think it was in Guatemala, was really criticized for this, because actually you're trying to sort of, I find it useful to think of the peace process and peace implementation as being how you corral the parties and the international actors around an ongoing project of implementation. So actually, the purpose of assessing a ceasefire breach, you don't have much you can do to punish that party. What you're trying to do is pull them back into the process, and actually blame and unilateral blame is sometimes useful for that, but sometimes trying to create the fiction of non-breach by anybody is important. So Sri Lanka, there was a weird situation where everybody was breaching all the time, but there was a joint international and local party fiction that nobody was breaching and the peace process was still in play. And ultimately somebody had to call time on that as well.
Right, Alan, you have a quick comment on that too, please?
Well, a general one, that the problem often is not so much information, of which there's a surfeit, but intelligence. What do you make of all of that stuff that's being thrown at you from various sources, local and international, and so forth? And that was a constant problem, which the UN in particular faced because of its absence of, frankly, real-time intelligence capabilities. And there was a risk then when you came into these situations of ceasefire, who was doing what to whom. And there is, of course, if you pronounce somebody guilty, the other party then takes pleasure and advantage. Well, the accused get very angry with you. I found, though, based on what in a number of countries, the best was to be very honest and direct about that, because while they may get angry that you've pointed this out, over time it builds your credibility and this was really important, I found, in Sierra Leone, where we didn't automatically blame the RUF for every infringement of a ceasefire. And that actually proved very important, because then they developed a trust, particularly in the force commander and the deputy force commander, that they were telling the truth and that we weren't just automatically dumping on them. And that tended to help to keep them in the peace process. One last thought, though, in terms of all those who are engaged, we talked a lot about sort of the NGOs and the rest of it. Also remember governments themselves. When I was in the Congo, by the time I left, there were between 10 and 11 special envoys from various countries, all with an agenda that varied. That became impossible. We used to have meetings, coordinating meetings, just among the special representatives to try to reach some common approach. It becomes impossible. You can really have just too much information, too many partners, and then it becomes literally unmanageable.
And too many interests, to go back to your point, Dennis.
Absolutely.
Okay, quick comment, Richard, because I've got someone I want to invite in to ask a question. So very quick comment.
Well, that was it. I mean, I think Alan touched on something that you had raised earlier yourself about the many interests. But again, it's the fundamental point about being able to cope sometimes either with a lot of information or, as Alan was saying, the analysis, the intelligence. We don't maybe want to talk about it now, but there have been innovations in machine learning in UN and other peace operations that are working to, if you will, try to digest this abundance of information and provide even real-time analysis of what's happening, giving the very sophisticated monitoring tools that are being developed, and that would be maybe an interesting topic for another session. But I just flagged that.
Yes, just a very brief comment before I invite someone in. The problem is, in a way, interests keep changing. Also, their interests are always on the move. So you pin interest down at one point, it might be perfectly accurate, and some sort of concord is reached. A year later, the interests have changed. Anyhow, I want to invite in John Cockell to ask a question. John, are you there?
John is in Mali.
Yes. Well, can you hear me all right?
Yes, we do.
A quick question, because we're running short of time, but off you go.
No, thanks so much. And Richard, it's wonderful to hear you speak on these issues again. And congratulations on your latest book. I will be putting in my order this evening. And greetings to everybody from MINUSMA headquarters in Bamako, Mali. We've been talking a lot about strategic assessment here recently, because we're heading towards a mandate review. But for us, strategic assessment is a large exercise that has a kind of methodology around it. We've been using it for over a decade. And as you may know, and perhaps Richard, you talk about it in your book, it's a fairly time-consuming exercise. It could take up to 6 months to produce recommendations for the Secretary General. But nevertheless, in Mali at the moment, we certainly have enough of a changed situation in the political and security circumstances of the country that would be highly relevant. But the time-consuming nature of it is to some extent what gives us pause. And it brings me around to a point that I was thinking of, that as I was listening to you speak about the different trade-offs that one faces when you're looking at the challenges of measuring peace, particularly in an ongoing peace operation. And I'm reminded of the wisdom of builders, I think you call them in the UK, or let's say housing contractors. If anyone's tried to renovate an old house, usually you get told by a builder at some point that, yes, you want it fast and you want it cheap, and you want it good. Well, you can have two of those things at one time, but you can't have all three. And I sort of feel that way about measuring peace in peacekeeping. And it's the dilemma that we face here in implementing our current mission plan. My challenge and my role here is to lead the planning unit for the mission. And what I want to try to do with measuring peace is provide tools for the senior leadership, including the SRSG. So going back to the point that Alan was making a moment ago about how useful it would be to have this kind of guidance being given to the SRSG and other mission leadership on a rolling basis. We're trying to do that indeed on a quarterly basis, and to use data and to use qualitative assessments, but built around the results that we're trying to achieve in our mission plan. It's quite difficult to turn that around on a quarterly basis and in a way that is in depth enough to cover the different dimensions of what is happening in the country situation. So my question for you, Richard, is that I don't know if any of the good practices that you looked at this dilemma of trying to provide a structured assessment of peace metrics on a quarterly basis that are directed towards decision support for senior leadership within missions, and whether any of those good practices use something like household surveys, to get that ethnographic element that you want. Thanks so much for taking my question. Great to be with you all.
Right, Richard, very brief answer to that. We're just about out of time, and I want to have Christine and Alan have a brief comment as well. So Richard, why don't you start? Brief
okay, comment. Well, no, I am aware of, I don't know whether it was in your case with you, Alan, but SRSGs have told me that they have themselves relied sometimes on perception surveys to get a sense of what the mood was, if you will. And there are various ways of conducting consultations in countries to gain to gauge the appetite also for various proposals. But the way that John, you were talking about the time it takes to prepare sometimes these analyses, these assessments, and the extent to which, again, circumstances can change so significantly in that period of time. I think that that's also a challenge that certainly a lot of practitioners, a lot of analysts have to deal with. There are various tools. The OSCE I had a very interesting and sophisticated toolkit to enable them to take stock of developments on the ground with respect to evolving conflict conditions. And I think that to the extent that we can be responsive quickly, but also accurately, it's a real challenge, but it is something that I think is important, if it can be achieved, to be able to feed into the thinking and the planning for leadership at all levels in country and also in headquarters, if we're talking about multilateral organizations.
Thank you very much, Richard. Alan, a quick final comment?
Just on this particular issue of information intelligence and perceptions that Richard and colleague from MINUSMA raised, John Cockle. I think, yeah, we did do some perception analysis based on some polling work and so forth, but it wasn't very sophisticated. I think today it could be a lot more sophisticated. And I think you're likely to get very different answers in a particularly large country with many different ethnic groups, east or west, north or south, you'll get very different answers. What I would say, however, is that at a more national level, some of that work's already being done by organizations like Afrobarometer, which does every other year or yearly surveys on a select number of questions, which now provide a time series. Now, they won't break down in terms of individual, although I think they do basically an urban-rural divide. But those I found very useful and helpful to measure a little bit the sentiment, popular sentiment as regards certain things like freedom of expression, reaction or to policing, things like that. So that was quite useful, but in terms of doing the more granular work, that I think would involve a lot of additional effort and would need would need a considerable input, I think,
Okay.
over some time to develop some sort of time series that would be useful for decision making.
Thank you, Alan. Christine, I've kept you to have the last word.
Oh, I don't know if it should really be the last word, but I suppose just maybe what's really struck me in my work, and I think it's come through from the discussion, is the need to sort of simplify entry points to data and be able to take some broad reductive insights out of it. It seems to me this is really a central challenge. And I have wondered, I think one of the questions was really about, do we really know the conflict drivers? And we actually don't have great theories for that and consensus around those. But it does strike me that two things are really important that could be assessed. One is whether people's life capacities, and I do like that SEND framing, are getting better or worse across, and I think Alan said it out as security, economic and political matters. But the second is really critical in my view. Often conflict doesn't depend on those things being delivered or not, but whether people have a sense that they have agency over those things. And I never really see agency being talked about. So where people feel they cannot change things and their conditions are bad and look to be bad in perpetuity, in my experience, that's really the combination conflict driver. Where people feel the situation's bad, but they have some roots of agency to change it, it reduces the chances of conflict. And of course, where people's situation is getting better, their agency may be less important because they feel the things they want are being delivered by, say, good government. And I think if we maybe talked a little bit and provided ways, thought a little bit about what the assessments and combined assessments of different forms of agency by different political groups, different rural constituencies, to me that would be more interesting data than perceptions, which we know from criminology and things are very much affected by the last thing that happened in ways that can distort and are also only as good and as lasting as the moment. I think if we ask more foundational questions of people about their own sense of agency in their situation, for me that's sort of a little bit critical, and I think there would be ways of measuring that.
Well, thank you, everybody. I'm afraid we have to call an end there. Time is up. Thank you very much, Richard, for writing the book in the first place. We much appreciate that. Thank you for your exposition of the argument. Christine and Alan, again, your comments have been of enormous interest and value. So, and I'd like to finally thank the audience who have been most attentive to what has been said. I'm sorry if one or two of you have made comments that we haven't dealt with, but I did want to confine the discussion to peace agreements and the idea of peace within a community. So thank you very much again, and I wish you all a good day.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.